Rhodesia is a country about the size of California with a population less than Florida's. 6 million blacks who have not very much, 250,000 whites who have just about everything. And let's get the travelogue part of this story out of the way. Rhodesia is just north of South Africa and, with the exception of South Africa, is surrounded by hostile neighbors. It is a country of magnificent sights, of magnificent climate. Scenes so lovely they must have been gazed upon by angels, is the way the good Dr. Livingston described Victoria Falls when he came upon them in 1855. When the first white settlers trekked in about 90 years ago, they were not unlike the American settlers who moved west a little earlier. The idea of the little house on the prairie is as African as it is American. The natives were less hostile here, and so indeed were the settlers, who trekked and farmed and built and wrought themselves a great country. A country that by the rules of the first half of this century was perfectly okay. But for all kinds of reasons, the rules of the second half of the century have been changed, and Rhodesia is an outcast nation. Up to 1965, it was a self-governing colony of Britain. But when Britain demanded that Rhodesia give way to majority rule, black rule, the Prime Minister, Ian Smith, declared the colony independent. The white minority was charting its own course. It was denounced as an outlaw nation. Economic sanctions were placed on imports and exports. Britain said Smith wouldn't last 2 weeks. He's lasted 12 years. But 12 years of turmoil. In the 70s, militant black nationalists formed the Patriotic Front. Using sanctuaries in other African states and Soviet arms, they declared guerrilla war against the whites and against blacks who cooperated with the government. The front was led by 2 men, Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, bitter rivals but allies against Smith. Some whites pulled out, but mostly they dug in their heels, and the country became an armed camp. Sweet little old-fashioned Rhodesia was brought smack into the world.
Any firearms listed, sir? No. Any explosive things with you? No, nothing. Thank you.
There are reports of mercenaries being brought in to fight Rhodesia's war. In fact, it is mostly a people's war and a people's army. They're a stiff-necked bunch, these people, and love them or hate them, you've got to admire their grit. An odd combination of 20th century delights and technology and a 19th century pioneer spirit. You're tempted to compare this place with Vietnam. The 2 wars have the same look, but it's only the look that's the same. Here they like to compare themselves with the Israelis, a small, superbly trained force, audacious strikes deep into hostile territory. And most important of all, they'll tell you, they're defending their own land.
You've got to die somewhere. I'd rather die fighting for something that's worth fighting for, honestly. My children, my eldest son is 12, and he is proud to be a Rhodesian. He's patriotic, and I think patriotism in a child is something that you don't see everywhere in the world. And he already talks about when he's old enough to fight for this country. And he knows what it's about. He knows that you can lose your life, but he's prepared to do it. And I think that's fantastic.
If you believed that a white Rhodesian army was fighting the border war and the internal war against Rhodesian blacks, you couldn't be more wrong. Black Rhodesians, who by the way are not drafted but volunteer, outnumber whites in the police and the army by 7 to 1. And blacks are now becoming officers. Rhodesia is changing. In education, scenes like this would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. Public education is still segregated, but it's loosening. And private education, for the few blacks who can afford it, is integrated. Rhodesians feel put upon by the entire world, that their critics confuse them with South Africa and have not tried to understand that in its own way, Rhodesia is a developing country. They'll tell you that Rhodesia needs help, not hectoring from the sidelines. And they blame Britain and the United States, Foreign Secretary David Owen and UN Ambassador Andrew Young, both of whom recognize the Patriotic Front rather than Smith, who for 10 weeks has been negotiating with 2 popular African leaders for a transition to black majority rule. these men, Entabaningi Sitoli and Bishop Abel Muzorewa. Smith feels the free world wants him to concede to the men with the guns rather than negotiate with the men with the votes.
I can accept the communists don't want us to succeed. But the question I put to you and to the Americans is, why is it that the free world seems to be standing in our way? The free world led by Britain and America, because America has been drawn in now. I wonder why they are trying to trip us up and prevent us from achieving this almost ideal situation where we can prove in Rhodesia that the white man and the black man can go on living and working together in harmony for their mutual benefits in this part of Africa.
You've said you accept the principle of majority rule. Now, a lot of people looking at white Rhodesia and looking at Ian Smith will say, yes, if Smith is saying it, there's got to be a catch somewhere. What's the catch?
Well, it is no catch, because we've got to go on living in this country with the blacks. And we would indeed be foolish if we resorted to sleight of hand or deceit, because it would mean thereafter we would have to live with these problems, and we would never create trust and confidence between white Rhodesians and black Rhodesians. We are going to try to negotiate into this new constitution the maintenance of certain standards of democracy, the preservation of things such as the impartiality of our courts of justice, our forces of law and order, the maintenance of decent standards. That is the sort of thing that we are trying to tie in, and to see if we can put the white man in a position where he will be satisfied that these standards will be preserved, and that they won't be thrown out of the window the moment this thing called majority rule takes place in Rhodesia.
The case for majority rule may be an overwhelming one in this day and age. But is there a case for the whites in Rhodesia? They feel they've rarely been given a fair hearing.
I think there is an obsession in the world today which is along the lines that any white man in Africa is wrong just because he's white. If you've got a black skin, then whatever you do is right. Well, I want to be scrupulously fair. We are building a country here where black and white can live together, we hope, and will have equal rights and equal treatment. But the last thing we're prepared to accept is that because we've got a white skin, we are wrong in Africa, especially when we look at the history of this country, when we know what the white man has done for Rhodesia in a very short time, about 70 years or so. This was one of the last parts of the world that came into touch with Western civilization. When our forefathers came here, there was no civilization. There was no such thing as a cart with a wheel. There was no education. There was no written language in this part of Africa. That gives you some idea of the kind of situation that existed when we came.
For whites, it is the essential colonial life. We made all this possible, they'll tell you, and so they see no sin in taking their pleasures. They see a great deal wrong with outsiders telling them they must give them up in order to conform to some theory of human rights that anyway barely exists in only a handful of countries. So why pick on Rhodesia? Even with the absence of full civil rights, of majority rule, Rhodesia's black citizens have more freedom, more of an even break at life, more choice than the people in many of the 49 independent states of Africa, most of which are dictatorships, oligarchies, or one-party states. It would be extremist to compare Rhodesia with Idi Amin's Uganda or Emperor Bokassa's Central African Empire. But there are many lesser Ugandas with which Rhodesia can happily compete in the world's human rights contest. Mozambique to the east, South Africa to the south, and if you like, Haiti in the very shadow of the United States. But it's been Rhodesia's misfortune to find itself stuck on a chessboard, an international game in which only black can win. Stuck on a continent on which white faces make bad causes. This is only a chess game of no great significance, but it's the kind of thing you can come upon quite casually in Salisbury. It's a sight that might have been impossible a dozen years ago, but one that suggests that white Rhodesia indeed is changing, that left alone, there is a chance of one African republic emerging that could set an embarrassing example for the rest. To the eye or to the camera, life in Rhodesia can be seen to be free of the abject segregation, the apartheid of South Africa. The management no longer reserves the right of admission, and white Rhodesians feel they have made giant strides in only a few years. In the daily commerce, the diversions of life, people mix easily.
3-1.
This can also be seen as mere cosmetics, that it ignores the psychological and very real legislative barriers that still keep this society separate and unequal. In housing, there are just the beginning tentative steps towards integrated neighborhoods, but for the most part, urban Africans live in the so-called townships. Paternalism it may be, but the country has perhaps the best educated, best fed, healthiest population in Africa. What there is not yet for the common working man in Rhodesia is the easy opportunity to break out of a life that has been ordained for him by the color of his skin. Smith feels that is changing, that it must change, that the only way to achieve that change and protect the stake of Rhodesia's 250,000 whites is through a gradual handing over to moderates, and not, as the Anglo-American plan would have it, to the Patriotic Front. You can, with no trouble at all, find people among white Rhodesian settlers who are racist beyond redemption. Caricatures of the southern African redneck. People, it would seem, who would never abide even the most moderate black government. Maybe so. And it could be that a Smith, once the reddest of rednecks himself, might be able to pull this country together, achieve in Africa what is only just being achieved in parts of the United States. It's ironic that it's the Army that could make this a truly multiracial society. It's in the Army that most young Rhodesians have any chance to share an experience equally. And the show of support for our boys seems to be totally non-racial. If anything has brought Rhodesians together, it is this.
We humbly commend the soul of this thy servant.
There were 2 funerals in Salisbury today. This one for Corporal Alfie Tennant, age 31, married, 2 children, killed in active duty. And in the patriotic and quite moving language of such services, Corporal Tennant was killed in the defense of his country. And later this afternoon, there was this funeral. Sergeant Obert Malassi, age 24, married, 3 children. The 2 men are buried side by side. Sergeant Malassi, too, died for his country.
Unto himself the soul of our dear brother here departed. We therefore commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
There are 2 or maybe 20 ways of looking at life in this patch of Africa. The contrast may be so stark as to offend the eye. The world's too distant to ever make a nation. But new voices are being heard, and old voices are changing.
Let us offer to Almighty God our prayers that the killings may cease.
Perhaps it's merely the routine schizophrenia of Rhodesian life. Pride in the country they've built, guilt about the way it was done. Their hearts stuck in pale nostalgic memory, their heads facing the black reality of Africa. Perhaps that odd mixture could produce a bright new idea on what is in so many ways still a dark continent. Foreign economic sanctions have forced Rhodesians of both races to get by on their own resources. Perhaps a sanction on foreign interference would allow them to get on with that notion, one that combines the reality of Africa with the idealism of a few people. Given half a chance, it could succeed.